Welcome to Radio BFit. Jumping into another deep dive today, and I have a question to start us off. What if I told you that one of the most legendary sets of abdominal muscles in the history of physical culture belonged to a guy who who literally refused to do sit-ups?
I mean, honestly, if we were looking at today's source material, I'd say that sounds like one of those terrible late night infomercial pitches. But, knowing what we're digging into today, it
Yeah.
actually makes perfect sense.
Right. It is such a wild hook to start with, but it really perfectly frames what we are unpacking in this deep dive because I think there's this universal rite of passage everyone goes through when they decide they want to get in shape.
Totally. The classic living room floor routine.
Exactly. It's usually late in the evening, maybe a Tuesday, the house is quiet, and you just find yourself lying flat on the rug, staring up at the ceiling, doing an absolute million crunches.
Usually with the TV still playing in the background.
Yeah, just yanking on the back of your head, doing rep after rep, completely desperate to feel that mythical burn we've all been conditioned to chase. And what is the actual biological result of all that effort?
A lot of pain, usually.
A very sore neck, a deeply irritated lower back, and absolutely zero structural changes when you look in the mirror the next morning. I am incredibly guilty of this, by the way. My old routine was exactly that. Just me, a carpet, and a massive amount of misplaced optimism.
We've all been there. Anyone who has ever wanted to feel a bit more resilient or, just wanted to change their aesthetic has gone through that exact phase. There's this deeply ingrained cultural assumption that if an exercise hurts, and if you do a sheer exhausting volume of it,
It must be working.
right, it must be effective. It's the whole no pain, no gain mentality dialed up to 100. But our mission today is to completely deconstruct that. We are pulling from the archives of a Soviet strength legend named Pavel and looking at some incredibly counterintuitive secrets about how the human core actually functions.
And this material is so fascinating because it flies in the face of almost everything you see pushed by fitness algorithms right now. If you open any social media app, you are bombarded with these 10-minute high-speed, 100-rep ab blaster circuits.
Core promise here, the real paradigm shift we want to guide you through today, is that building a foundation of immense core strength has nothing to do with chasing lactic acid. It's not about treating your midsection like an endurance muscle that needs to be exhausted.
It's about treating it like a structural pillar.
Yes, it's about mastering two very specific, deeply neurological skills. The skill of creating mechanical tension and using your breath as the ultimate control switch for that tension.
Let's start by completely reframing how we view the core, shifting away from that endurance mindset to what the source text calls the powerlifter paradigm. Because the foundational rule and the biggest mistake people make on those living room rugs is thinking that high-rep spinal flexion is the goal.
It's really not. Doing hundreds of crunches is not only completely ineffective for burning fat around the midsection, but it actively degrades the structures of the lower back.
And the biology of that is incredibly important to understand, right? Why does the lower back get irritated?
Well, if you look at the spine, it's essentially a stack of hard vertebrae separated by these squishy, fluid-filled discs. Your spine is beautifully designed to stabilize and transfer force.
Right.
But when you lie on your back and perform a crunch, you are forcefully flexing that spine under load.
Yeah.
You're wedging the front of those vertebrae together, which squeezes the squishy disc backward toward your spinal nerves.
Ouch. So doing that 100 times in a row is essentially just asking for a bulging disc.
It is mechanically disastrous over the long term. Pavel's rule is that you have to completely stop treating your abdominals like they are some unique magical tissue that only responds to a marathon of reps.
You have to treat them like a heavy lift.
Exactly. You treat abdominal training the exact same way a world-class athlete treats a heavy deadlift or a massive squat. You need low repetitions, but extremely high, neurologically demanding tension.
That completely changes the context of gym behavior. I mean, you would never see a powerlifter walk up to a barbell, load 600 pounds onto it, and attempt to do 80 rapid-fire squats.
It would be comical. They would be crushed.
But for some reason, we walk over to the yoga mat and abandon all logic about how muscle actually gets stronger.
And that disconnect brings us to a really fascinating concept from the research, the difference between external cues and internal cues. When most people start working out, the focus is entirely external. You're watching yourself in the gym mirror. You're obsessing over the number on the dumbbell.
You're just trying to move the weight from point A to point B.
Right. just surviving the movement. It's a very superficial way of interacting with your own anatomy. But the text notes that advanced world-class strength is built internally. It's not about the weight moving.
It's about the brain's connection to the muscle moving the weight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's this incredible anecdote in the sources about a world record-holding bench presser. This is a guy moving astronomical amounts of weight, breaking global records, and he openly admitted that it took him years of training just to truly understand how to internally engage his triceps during the press.
That is a staggering thought. A literal world record holder taking years just to feel a specific muscle turn on properly. It really exposes the superficiality of those influencer cardio ab routines.
Oh, completely.
The person in the video is bouncing around performing 100 reps of bicycles and toe touches, just surviving it. Meanwhile, the strongest humans on the planet are moving with this deep, agonizingly intense internal focus for maybe 3 or 4 reps.
To give a very concrete example of what this powerlifter paradigm looks like for the core, the material highlights the approach used by Dr. Andrew Huberman. He completely skips the endless sit-up circuits. Instead, his protocol is incredibly stripped down. He does 5 sets of 5 repetitions of hanging pike.
That is just 5 reps per set. But let's break down what a strict hanging pike actually requires, because it is not just lifting your legs.
No, not at all.
You're hanging from a bar, which means your grip, your lats, and your shoulders are fully engaged just to keep you stable. Then, without swinging, without using momentum, you have to contract your entire anterior chain to lift your straight legs all the way up to the bar.
The amount of mechanical tension and central nervous system output required to do that perfectly for 5 reps is astronomical compared to a standard crunch.
It's a full-body neurological event. The tension is the workout. You know, I think the gym confusion here is so thick and people get so lost in the weeds of fitness advice that an analogy might help visualize the difference.
Let's hear it.
I look at those high-rep crunch routines kind of like trying to chop down a massive ancient oak tree with a butter knife.
A butter knife.
Yeah. You are out there in the yard, you're sweating profusely, you're making thousands of tiny, exhausting movements. You feel like you're working incredibly hard because your heart rate is up and you're tired.
Right.
But there is absolutely no mechanical power behind what you are doing. You are just scratching the bark and exhausting yourself.
You're mistaking fatigue for effectiveness.
Yes. Whereas the powerlifter approach, the 5 heavy, meticulously controlled reps of a hanging pike, is like walking up to that exact same oak tree with a massive, perfectly sharpened lumberjack's axe.
Right. Fewer swings.
Exactly. It only takes a few precise, high-tension, highly focused strikes, and the structural goal is achieved. The tree comes down. It is entirely about the quality, the physics, and the power of the movement, not the sheer mindless volume of it.
The butter knife versus the heavy axe.
Yeah.
That is a fantastic way to conceptualize it. But I want to push back a little on behalf of the listener.
Okay, go for it.
The phrase internal cues and neurological tension can sound incredibly intimidating. If someone is listening to this during their morning commute and they've never lifted a heavy barbell or they can't even hang from a bar yet, how do they actually go about finding that internal tension?
Right.
If it took a world record holder years to feel his triceps, how does an everyday person turn on their core?
That is the million-dollar question. Because if internal tension is the secret weapon, there has to be a biological mechanism that triggers it. We can't just close our eyes, think the words get tight, and expect our anatomy to magically respond.
There has to be a physiological switch.
Right. And according to the research, that switch is entirely dependent on pressure. It all comes down to the mechanics of human breath.
Which brings us to the pneumomuscular reflex. This is arguably the most important concept in the entire deep dive. This is where breath physically acts as the volume knob for your physical strength.
The neuromuscular reflex. It sounds like high-level science fiction, but it's hardwired evolutionary biology.
It is deeply hardwired. This mechanism was extensively studied by Soviet spirit scientists back in the 70s and 80s. During the Cold War, the Soviets were absolutely dominating global weightlifting, and part of their advantage was that they weren't just studying muscles, they were studying the nervous system.
Because muscles are just dumb engines waiting for a signal.
Exactly. The brain and the nervous system are the drivers.
So what did they discover about this reflex?
They proved that the physical pressure inside your abdominal cavity, your intra-abdominal pressure, directly controls the magnitude of the electrical signal your brain is allowed to send to your skeletal muscles.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping this. More physical pressure in the gut literally equals a stronger electrical signal to the limbs.
Yes.
It's not just a psychological trick where you just yell and hype yourself up before a lift.
No, it's a genuine, measurable reflex. The pressure stimulates mechanoreceptors deep in your core, which send an immediate signal up the spinal cord to the brain, effectively telling the central nervous system the spine is completely secured, it is safe to fire the cannons.
Wow.
Think of it this way. Imagine your brain is a high-end music player, and your muscles are the physical speakers. The intra-abdominal pressure is the master volume knob. If the pressure inside your core is low, the music is forced to be quiet. The signal is weak, no matter how hard you try to flex.
But as you physically increase that internal pressure,
You are turning up the dial on the strength signal your brain is physically capable of sending to the biceps, the quads, the lats.
that is incredible. It completely reframes the basic act of breathing because usually when someone gets ready to lift something heavy, like a couch or a heavy box, they just open their mouth wide and take a massive gulp of air into their chest.
But the Soviet methodology is adamant that you should never do that. Top lifters do not gulp air. They create airway resistance on the way in.
Because a wide open mouth doesn't engage the right musculature. To turn up that volume knob, you want to breathe in through pursed lips, almost like you're sucking air through a very tiny, rigid straw.
Or you inhale sharply through a single nostril.
What does that resistance actually do inside the body?
It forces your diaphragm to do the work. The diaphragm is this large, parachute-shaped muscle sitting right below your lungs. When you sip air in through resistance, that parachute powerfully flattens out and descends downward into your abdominal cavity.
It pushes all your internal organs, your stomach, your liver, your intestines down and out.
Exactly. You are driving the air low, rather than just shrugging your shoulders up and filling the top of your chest.
And then once that diaphragm has descended and pushed everything down, you have to trap it to create the pressure. The air is in, but now you have to close the container.
You contract the pelvic floor to seal the bottom, and you brace the abdominal wall to seal the sides.
The source material shares this brilliant quote from a Russian weightlifting coach who described this state, which is technically called the Valsalva maneuver, as an exhalation that didn't happen.
I love that.
I cannot get over how poetic that is for something so brutally physical. An exhalation that didn't happen.
It perfectly illustrates the physics of the moment. You have built up this immense intention of pushing the air out. Your muscles are contracting to force the air up, but you are physically blocking the exit at the vocal cords.
The result is a super stiff, highly pressurized cylinder.
Exactly. And when you connect this biological reality to our everyday modern lives, it explains so much about human fatigue. Think about when you are stressed out, rushing to a meeting, or hunched over a keyboard answering a difficult email. How are you breathing?
It's always shallow. It's always up in the collarbones.
Always. We take these tiny, rapid chest breaths. We completely disconnect from the diaphragm and the deep core pressure. And by doing so, according to the pneumomuscular reflex, we are literally walking around, turning the volume knob all the way down on our own physical and neurological strength.
We are just existing at a volume level of 1 or 2 all day long, wondering why our lower backs ache when we pick up a dropped pen.
You know, knowledge really is your best personal trainer, and that's what BeFit.ai is all about. We try to share everything you need to make fitness and wellness click. If you want a simple breakdown later, there are free articles that make all this stuff feel clear and doable.
And having those clear breakdowns is crucial because, I have to be completely honest here, when I hear the phrase trapping an exhalation and building massive internal pressure, my immediate reaction is a mild sense of medical panic.
Like your head is going to explode.
Yes. I immediately picture those viral videos of powerlifters getting bright red in the face, the veins bulging out of their forehead, looking like their head is about to pop off like a champagne cork. The text actually includes a very serious warning about this, doesn't it?
It does. It stresses that you must keep the pressure isolated in the core and out of the head and neck.
How does someone safely navigate that? How do you create pressure without giving yourself a massive headache or spiking your blood pressure dangerously?
That is a highly valid concern, and it's where technique separates amateurs from professionals. The danger comes from where you direct the physiological tension. If you just take a huge breath, squeeze your eyes shut, tense your jaw, and bear down into your neck, all that vascular pressure travels straight upward into your cranium.
Which is the exact opposite of what we want.
Exactly. That's the opposite.
So how do you keep it down?
You have to conceptualize the pressure as a downward and outward force. You are sealing it off at the pelvic floor, the very bottom of your torso, and pushing out against your obliques and lower back. Meanwhile, your jaw, your face, and your neck should remain relatively relaxed.
It's a highly specific motor skill. It takes dedicated practice to isolate that pressure exclusively within the cylinder of your midsection without letting it bleed up into your head.
Right. And because it's such a specific neurological skill, it's not something you can just intuitively know how to do on your first try. Thankfully, the source material doesn't just leave us with a theory, it provides a highly practical drill.
And the beauty of this drill is that it's the most accessible application imaginable. You don't need a gym, you don't need weights, you don't even need to stand up.
This is easily my favorite takeaway from the entire analysis, the desk workout.
It completely democratizes strength training. The concept here is internal isometrics. An isometric is just a muscle contraction without any change in length, like pushing against a brick wall.
Right.
But in this case, we are taking that volume knob, that pneumomuscular reflex, and we are working against the pressure that our own body creates internally.
Let's break down this seated drill step by step. If you are listening to this right now, maybe you're stuck in traffic during your commute or you're sitting at your office desk, you can literally try this right along with us safely.
Let's do it. Step 1. You want to take a normal-sized breath, but the key is directing it deep down into your abdomen, not your chest. And remember the resistance rule. Do this by inhaling sharply through pursed lips, like you're trying to suck a thick milkshake through a very narrow straw.
Or just pull the air forcefully through one nostril.
Right.
As you do that, you should feel your stomach physically expand outward, pushing away from your spine. Once the air is low, step 2 is to contract your pelvic floor. Pavel's cue for this is legendary because it's so profoundly human.
The restroom cue.
Yes. His mental cue is, imagine you desperately have to go to the restroom, the facility is very far away, and you are trying with all your might to stop yourself from having an accident.
It always gets a laugh, but it is a stroke of coaching genius.
It really is.
The anatomical term contract your pelvic floor is incredibly abstract for most people, but the restroom cue instantly translates this weird, obscure muscle group into a very visceral, everyday physical sensation that every single human being immediately understands how to execute.
It instantly locks the bottom of the cylinder. So now you have the air driven low, and you are holding it from the bottom like you're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic. Step 3, place your tongue gently between your teeth and begin to hiss the air.
But this cannot be a lazy, gentle sound like a snake.
No. The text specifically calls for a ratcheting, forceful hiss. Imagine you're letting the air escape in tiny, highly pressurized bursts, like a pneumatic tire valve.
And as you perform that ratcheting hiss, step 4 is to actively focus the resulting pressure entirely into your midsection. Remember the warning, keep your face soft, keep your neck relaxed.
If you do this ratcheting hiss right now, while seated, you will immediately feel the entire circumference of your waist. The rectus abdominis in the front, the obliques on the sides, the spinal erectors in the back contract powerfully.
Feels like a thick, muscular corset has just wrapped itself around your spine.
It is astonishing how much raw tension you can generate while completely stationary in an office chair. To really picture what is happening structurally inside your body, think about an unopened, carbonated soda can.
Ooh, I like this analogy.
You take a full, sealed can of soda, you can literally place it on the ground and carefully stand your entire body weight on top of it. Because the liquid and the carbonation create immense internal pressure pushing outward evenly against the thin aluminum walls, that tiny can becomes incredibly rigid and stable. It refuses to crush.
But the absolute second you pop that top tab and release the pressure,
It collapses instantly into a flat disc under the exact same amount of weight.
that analogy perfectly mirrors spinal mechanics. When we do not maintain this internal intra-abdominal pressure, our human spine is that empty, unsealed soda can. We are inherently fragile, just waiting to get crushed under the load of a heavy barbell.
Or honestly, just crushed under the accumulated weight of a long day of terrible desk posture.
Exactly. By executing this internal isometric drill, you are sealing the can. You are transforming a vulnerable stack of bones into an indestructible, stable cylinder.
And once you master that seated pressurized cylinder, a completely new universe of physical training opens up. Because the logical next question is, what happens when you take that precise skill, that locked-in pressurized soda can, and you apply it to heavy compound barbell lifting?
The source text drops a massive twist here, and it completely alters how we approach programming.
The twist is that, assuming you master this technique, you might actually get to graduate from doing dedicated abdominal workouts entirely.
Which is the greatest news imaginable for anyone who is sick of grinding out those living room floor crunches.
The radical proposition here is that once the neurological skills of tension and power breathing are truly mastered, isolated abdominal exercises, the sit-ups, the crunch machines, the leg raises become largely redundant. To illustrate this, the text brings up the absolute legend, Franco Columbu.
For those who might not be deep into bodybuilding history, Franco Columbu was a Golden Era Mr. Olympia winner. He was a close friend and training partner of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was universally recognized as having arguably the greatest, most deeply etched abdominal development in the history of the sport. His core was impossibly thick and defined.
And Pavel recounts a fascinating piece of history where Columbu flat out stated, "I hate ab training." The human being with the most celebrated abdominals on the planet despised training them, and famously rarely ever did.
Because he achieved that insane level of core hypertrophy simply by staying tight and utilizing this exact power breathing methodology during his incredibly heavy compound lifts.
Think about the physique of that. When Columbu would load 500 or 600 pounds onto a barbell for a heavy squat or a deadlift, his core had to generate a monumental amount of isometric tension just to keep his spine from snapping in half.
The transverse abdominis, the obliques, they were working at maximum capacity just to stabilize the skeletal system.
Exactly. Under that kind of load, the abdominals are getting a far more intense growth stimulus than they ever would from 100 bodyweight crunches.
It all comes down to the required stimulus. At an advanced heavy lifting level, correctly bracing the torso to handle massive loads forces your core to do more physical work in 10 seconds than a standard ab circuit does in 10 minutes.
But here's the catch. A heavy set of squats takes time. It might take 30 or 40 seconds to complete. You cannot simply hold your breath, Valsalva style, for 40 seconds while moving hundreds of pounds. You would pass out from a lack of oxygen.
Right, so to do this safely, you have to learn an advanced technique known as breathing behind the shield.
Breathing behind the shield.
It sounds like a technique from an ancient martial arts scroll. How does someone actually perform that in the middle of a grueling lift?
Well, the shield is that tightly braced, pressurized cylinder we just built with a desk drill. When you are under a prolonged effort, you have to maintain that immense core pressure, keeping the structural soda can sealed while simultaneously taking very shallow, tactical sips of air.
You keep the abdominal wall locked down, but you allow just enough air exchange in the very top of your lungs to keep oxygen flowing to the brain so you remain conscious.
You're separating the act of breathing from the act of spinal stabilization. And Pavel actually tests this specific skill in his live workshops with a demonstration that is just wild to visualize.
Oh, the standing thing.
Yes. He will have a student lie down flat on the floor, instruct them to brace their core, and then he will literally step up and stand his entire body weight directly on the student's stomach.
Which proves the shield is structurally sound and the tension is high.
Exactly, but then he takes it a step further. While standing on them, he commands the student to sing a song out loud.
That is the ultimate proof of mastery.
It really is. Because if you can support the localized weight of a fully grown man standing on your viscera and still control your airway enough to vocalize a melody, you have completely mastered breathing behind the shield. You are maintaining the structural integrity of the cylinder, but you are not just holding your breath in a panic. You have independent control over your vocal cords and your upper airway.
And hey, if you're enjoying this episode, we'd love it if you hit like or leave a comment. It really helps us get better at what we do, and honestly, that support is heartwarming. It's what keeps us going and motivates us to keep creating these episodes for you.
We really do read the comments and appreciate the support so much. It's the fuel that keeps this whole operation running.
Speaking of fuel, I have to admit, hearing the Franco Columbu story has me completely fired up. I am officially declaring my retirement from crunches right here, right now.
Oh boy.
I am never doing an isolated ab exercise again. I am just going to put a barbell on my back, brace my shield, and let the heavy squats do all the work.
Okay, let me gently tap the brakes on that enthusiasm for just a second.
Yeah.
I love the energy, but we have to provide some crucial context here.
Uh-oh.
Columbu was an elite athlete lifting massive, skeletal-crushing weights with absolute, biomechanically perfect bracing technique. The text makes it very clear that abandoning ab work is an advanced application. You do not magically get to skip dedicated core training just because you did 3 sets of light goblet squats with a kettlebell.
So The heavy lifts only replace the ab work if the load is actually heavy enough to demand that level of tension.
Precisely. You have to earn the right to retire from crunches. You earn it by putting in the months of practice to master the shield, and by getting strong enough that your compound lifts inherently demand maximum core activation. If your bracing is flawless and the weight is highly significant, then yes, the barbell is doing double duty. But until then, the foundational work is still required.
Fair enough. Reality check accepted. I will keep practicing the internal isometrics. But mastering this heavy shield, taking in that pressurized breath and ratcheting it out under extreme loads, it requires some very intense, forceful exhalations.
It does.
And that physiological requirement brings up a really fascinating clash with modern gym culture.
Which leads us into the final major concept we need to explore, the sound of strength, and why genuine physical effort is inherently biologically noisy.
This is arguably the most relatable social issue for anyone who works out in a public space. If you walk into almost any commercial franchise gym today, there's this deeply ingrained, unwritten rule, and sometimes an explicitly written rule about remaining perfectly quiet.
You're expected to gently set the weights down without a sound, you're expected to breathe silently, and you are absolutely under no circumstances allowed to grunt.
Some of the biggest gym chains literally have loud sirens installed on the wall that go off to shame you if you make a sound of exertion.
It is a massive conflict between modern social politeness and actual biomechanical optimization. The source text tackles this head-on and states unequivocally that vocalizations, the sharp hissing, the grunting, the sudden shouts, are not just theatrical performances.
It isn't just an arrogant lifter trying to draw attention to themselves in the mirror.
Right. It is the direct, unavoidable acoustic result of the exhalation that didn't happen.
Let's break down the physics of why that noise happens. When you are under a maximal load, let's say a heavy deadlift, you have built up that massive intra-abdominal pressure. You are the sealed soda can.
Exactly.
But as you push through the hardest part of the movement, the sticking point, that internal pressure becomes so immense that some of the air has to forcefully escape just to safely manage the load and prevent injury.
And as that highly pressurized air is violently forced through your tightened vocal cords, it creates a sound. The hiss or the grunt is just the auditory byproduct of a controlled, powerful exhalation pushing against a lockdown abdominal wall. It is the physical mechanism that spikes that pneumomuscular reflex exactly when you need it most.
The science backing this up is undeniable. The source material references clinical studies done on martial artists and competitive lifters where they actually measured physical force output on a force plate.
And what did they find?
They proved that vocalizing, whether it's a martial arts shout, a tennis player's grunt, or a powerlifter's hiss, directly and measurably increases neurological drive and muscular strength. By forcing yourself to remain totally silent during a maximal physical effort, you aren't just being polite, you are actively suppressing your central nervous system.
You're making yourself measurably weaker. Think of it like a heavy-duty pressure cooker sitting on a hot stove. When that pot builds up an immense amount of thermal heat and internal pressure to cook the food quickly, it has that tiny metal steam release valve on the very top. As the pressure hits its peak, that valve starts rattling, hissing, and spraying steam loudly into the kitchen.
Right.
That valve is not making a racket because it wants the attention of the toaster and the blender. It is a structural, physical necessity. It is safely managing an immense, dangerous force.
If you decided the noise was impolite and you plugged up that valve to silence it, the entire pot would catastrophically explode.
That is the perfect analogy. When you are lifting heavy, you are the pressure cooker. Your core is the pot, and your airway is the valve. Now, obviously, the text provides a caveat. You do not need to be performatively obnoxious.
There's a clear difference between a biomechanically necessary grunt to lock out a heavy deadlift and someone just screaming at the top of their lungs to show off for the room.
But we really want to validate the hesitation a lot of people feel. It is genuinely intimidating and socially awkward to be in a quiet, crowded gym full of people in headphones and to start audibly hissing through your teeth like a punctured tire.
We are so conditioned to be small and quiet.
But to reach your potential, you have to give yourself permission to make the acoustic sounds that your biology requires to be strong.
You have to let the pressure valve work. Strength is not a silent endeavor.
So as we wrap up this incredibly deep exploration, let's just trace the path of the journey we've been on. We started out lying on the living room rug, frustrated and in pain, and we are walking away with a completely new physiological toolkit.
We learned that the first step is abandoning those endless spine-damaging high reps and replacing them with the powerlifter paradigm, treating the core as a structure that requires high tension and low reps.
We uncovered the science of the pneumomuscular reflex, learning how intra-abdominal pressure acts as the neurological volume knob for our physical strength.
We practically applied that knowledge with the desk drill, learning how to use the restroom cue and the ratcheting hiss to create that pressurized soda can stability without even standing up.
We discussed the ultimate goal of breathing behind the shield, and how mastering that isometric tension under heavy loads might eventually allow you to graduate from isolated abdominal work entirely.
And lastly, we shattered the myth of the silent gym, giving you the biological permission to let the pressure valve work and make a little noise for the sake of true strength.
It's a dense amount of counterintuitive information, but it all points toward one incredibly empowering concept. We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, a mindset shift drawn straight from the core of the text.
What could you achieve in your physical life, not just in the gym, but in your posture, your resilience, and your longevity, if you stopped treating your core as just another superficial muscle meant to be burned and exhausted, and instead started treating it as a profound, lifelong neurological skill to be practiced?
It changes the entire goal of fitness. It takes the pressure off getting a six-pack and puts the focus entirely on mastering your own biological machinery. Just take it one step at a time.
The next time you are sitting in traffic or at your desk, try the internal isometric drill. Feel that tension, seal the cylinder, and see how it changes the way you carry yourself.
No extreme changes required, just mindful practice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for exploring these concepts with us. We always love diving into the science of human potential with you.
Keep breathing, keep your shield strong, and don't be afraid to make a little noise. See you soon.